Good day, everyone. Good day, sir. I hope you are all feeling great today. By the way, my name is Juliana Cassandra Nasio from BSBA FM4A, and our Group 6, will be discussing public borrowing. And before we dive into the discussion, let us first watch a short video clip about public borrowing. So I hope you will learn something about our topic, and without further ado, let us begin.
Wow, what a house. Maybe a little much for me though. Okay, this is probably more like what I can afford. Unless I could borrow the money to get something a little bigger. Perfect. But borrowing means that I could be in debt. And for a lot of people, that can be intimidating. But debt is really just a way of borrowing money with the promise of paying it back with interest. That sounds okay, right? Unless I would take out a big loan that I couldn't pay back. People take out loans all the time to buy houses, cars, to pay for school, all sorts of things. And it's not just people. Companies also borrow, and governments do it too. When a government borrows, it's called public debt or sovereign debt. Governments raise this money by issuing bonds and then selling them to the public with a guarantee that they'll pay them back. Just like people, countries need money to buy or build stuff that their income, mostly tax revenues, won't entirely pay for. Governments should invest their money wisely in things that help their citizens. Think of education or healthcare. Governments can also invest in things that will generate revenue or grow the economy, like infrastructure projects. Governments can also use the money to reduce taxes, or they can give it directly to its citizens who need the support. So, why are economists sometimes concerned by public debt? Well, for all the benefits that these funds can bring, there are also risks. Let's take two countries to demonstrate. Here's country A, and here's country B. Now, let's say both of them have borrowed roughly the same amount of money at roughly the same time. But looking closer, we can see they have very different economies, notably in size, measured by their gross domestic product, or GDP. Let's look at their debt levels again, but this time as a percentage of their GDP. And wow, you see the difference? Same debt, but very different outcomes. Countries are able to manage their debt when they borrow a reasonable amount relative to their ability to pay it. Country A's economy is big enough to pay the interest on the debt. If country B cannot pay things back, well, it gets harder to convince investors to lend you more money. And that is scary because it only gets harder from there. If an economic crisis hits, one of these guys will have the funds they need to respond. The other is going to need some help. The trick here is for governments, like country B, to invest the money they borrow wisely, which can help keep debt manageable. So, where does that leave me in my new house? Well, first, I need to adjust my own budget. I don't need that. You're gone. Definitely gone. And second, debt isn't about living beyond my means. It's about borrowing a reasonable amount relative to my ability to pay it, even if I do splurge every now and again.
So what is public borrowing? Public borrowing is a process by which a government obtains funds to cover the budget deficits or to finance a public projects or services. So it only takes place if the government does not have enough funds to sustain the needs of the people under that state or to finance certain infrastructure development or public services that the government can fund. So, public borrowing can influence the nation's economy by affecting the interest rates and inflation and it often involves the balancing short-term financial needs with long-term fiscal sustainability. So what about public debt? So public debt is the total amount of money that the government owes to the creditors internally and externally. It represents the accumulation of all the past borrowings of the government that has not yet been repaid. So public debt includes the various financial obligations such as the bonds, the loans, or other instruments that the government use to raise funds for public spending, whether for infrastructure, for social programs, or other budgetary needs. So, managing a public debt is crucial for maintaining an economic stability, as excessive debt can lead to a higher interest payments, reduced public spending, and potential financial crisis, which the government would want to prevent. So, to further elaborate, public debt and public borrowing are closely related, but it both have a distinct concepts. So, public borrowing simply refers to an act of acquiring funds by issuing the government bonds or other securities to cover the budget shortfalls or to finance a project, while the public debt, on the other hand, is a total amount of money that the government owes to the creditors as a result of the past borrowings. So, to put it simply, the public borrowings is the process of raising new funds, while the public debt represents the accumulation of these borrowed amounts over time, which reflects the overall obligation of the government that they need or must repay. So, there are several types of public debt. First is internal debt. So, these are the debt owed to the creditors within the country. This includes the loans taken from domestic banks, financial institutions, or individuals through the government bonds, securities, or other instruments. The second one is the external debt. So, these are the debt owed to a foreign creditors, including the international financial institution like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, as well as the foreign governments and foreign investors who purchase the government bonds. So this type of debt is a subject to foreign exchange risk. The third one is the productive debt. So this type of debt is incurred to finance a project or investment that generate economic growth or can produce a return that helps to repay the debt. So an example of this includes the infrastructure projects like roads, bridges, schools, and hospitals, which can enhance the productivity and stimulate the economic development of the country or the state. The fourth one is the unproductive debt. These are the debt that is incurred for the purpose that do not generate a direct economic return or create an asset that can help the country repay the debt. So this includes the borrowing for day-to-day transactions of government like expenses like salaries, pensions, or defense spending, which do not produce any additional income or asset within the country. So the next one is the compulsory debt. So this type of debt is rarely used and is raised by the government through mandatory contributions or forced loans. It typically takes place during emergencies like war, since whenever there's a war, there's a shortage in funds for military purposes. So the people under that state are are mandated to give a contributions for military purposes. So another one is the voluntary debt. So this kind of debt is willingly subscribed by the individuals or institutions, such as the government bonds, where, for example, an investor is voluntarily lend their money to the government in exchange for an interest payments over time. The next one is the redeemable debt. So these are the debt that the government promises to repay on a fixed date. So this includes the bonds and loans with a fixed maturity date. So it typically means that your money was safe in this kind of debt as you are promised to pay by the government on a specific date. While the next one, which is the irredeemable debt, is or also known as perpetual debt, is the debt that has no maturity date, and the government only pays the interest of it indefinitely without being required to repay the principals. Another one is short-term debt. So this type of debt must be repaid within a short period of time, typically less than 1 year. So governments often resort to short-term debt to cover temporary short budget shortfalls or manage the cash flows or address the immediate financial needs. So it includes instruments like treasury bills, the short-term notes or other similar financial instruments that are issued with a commitment to repay the principal and interest rate within a short time frame. And lastly, the long-term debt. So these are the debt with a longer maturity period. Usually it exceeded 1 year. So this includes the government bonds and loans used to finance a long-term projects such as the infrastructure projects, investments, and other activities or initiatives that require substantial funding and have a longer of period. Of course, there's a reason why the government would opt to or resort to public borrowing or to have a public debt. Firstly, to cover up the budget deficits. So, governments often experience situations where their expenditures exceeded the government's revenue from taxes, fees, or from other sources, leading to a budget deficit. So, this could be due to the increased spending on public services, social welfare programs, or unforeseen events like natural disasters or economic downturns, which reduces the tax revenue. So, instead of immediately raising the taxes or cutting essential services, which could have an adverse effect on the economy and effect on the public welfare, the government would resort to borrow instead. So, this borrowing helps them maintain the level of public services, pay the salaries, and fulfill other obligations without disrupting the economy of the country. So it is a tool to smooth out the fluctuations in revenue and expenditures over time. The next reason is to finance public infrastructure. So infrastructure development such as building roads, bridges, airports, schools, and hospitals requires a substantial investment. So this project are capital intensive and often cannot be financed from annual budget alone. So by borrowing, the governments can secure the necessary funds to undertake this large project without the delay. So infrastructure investments are typically considered a productive investment because they create assets that contribute to a long-term economic growth of the country. For example, a better transportation networks reduce the cost of moving goods and people. Thereby, it boosts the trade and economic activity. So, the benefits of these investments are realized over many years, making the long-term borrowing an appropriate financing method. Another reason is economic stimulus. During period of economic recession or slowdown, public sector spending often declines, leading to a reduced economic activity or higher unemployment rates. To counteract this, the government may borrow to finance stimulus measures such as increasing the public investment, providing tax cuts, or offering direct financial assistance to individuals and businesses. This borrowing funded spending injects money into the economy. It helps to boost demands, create jobs, and prevent deeper recessions. The idea is that the increased economic activity generated by the stimulus will over time increase the tax revenues and help pay back the borrowed funds. The next one is managing cash flow. So the government experience timing differences between when the revenues are collected as well as when the expenditures are due. To manage these mismatches and ensure that they can meet their financial obligations on time, the government may resort to short-term borrowing. This type of borrowing provides liquidity, allowing the government to smooth out rather the cash flows and avoid the payment delays. It is a common practice, especially in the situation where revenue collection is seasonal or subject to timing uncertainties. Financing existing debt. So, governments often have an existing debt that is coming due for repayment. Rather than paying off this debt with current revenues, which might strain the government budgets, the government may choose to refinance by issuing a new debt. So, this process involves borrowing new funds to pay off the old debt, often at more favorable interest rates with extended repayment terms. So refinancing can help reduce the overall cost of debt service, improve the cash flows, and manage the debt more efficiently and effectively. It is a strategy used to maintain the fiscal stability and avoid the potential economic disruptions that might arise from large and sudden repayments. Also, one of the reasons why the government opts to public borrowing is to respond to emergencies. So, emergencies like natural disaster, pandemics, war, or other crises can require immediate and substantial financial resources that far exceeded what is available in the government's budget. In such cases, borrowing is often the quickest and most effective way to mobilize the necessary funds. For instances, during the pandemic like the COVID-19, a government needed to increase the healthcare spending, provide the economic support to affected individuals and businesses, and invest in public health measures. So, borrowing enables the government to respond swiftly to these needs without having to delay the action while waiting for the tax revenues or reallocating funds from other critical areas. Another reason is investment in social programs. So, social programs such as education, healthcare, social security, or unemployment benefits are critical for promoting social welfare and economic stability. However, these programs can be expensive, particularly in times of economic stress or demographic changes. So, borrowing allows the governments to fund these programs without cutting other essential services or raising the taxes abruptly. So, by investing in human capital through the education, health, and social protection, the governments can enhance productivity, reduce the poverty, and promote social cohesion. So, the long term benefits of these investments often justify the initial borrowing. The next one is stabilizing the financial system. So, financial crisis can destabilize an economy, leading to bank failures, credit freezes, and economic construction. To prevent or mitigate such risk or crisis, government may borrow to provide liquidity to banks, support financial markets, or bail out key institutions that are critical to the economy's functioning. So, this borrowing can restore the confidence in the financial system. It prevents the panic and ensure the smooth operation of credit markets. By stabilizing the financial system, the government can help avoid more severe economic downturns and protect the jobs, savings, and investment. Lastly, to support the monetary policy. So public borrowing can support the government's monetary policy objectives, such as controlling the inflation, managing the exchange rates, or influence the interest rates. For example, by issuing the government bonds, a government can influence the money supply in the economy. When the government borrows by selling bonds, it takes out the money into the circulation, which can help control the inflation. So conversely, repaying the debt can inject the money into the economy, while the government borrowing can impact the interest rates. High levels of borrowing might lead to higher interest rates, while the low levels might have the opposite effect. So managing these variables is crucial for maintaining the economic stability. So consequently, public borrowing is a versatile tool that the governments use to manage financial challenges, invest in long term growth, and respond to crises as well as support the broader economic objectives. It allows for flexibility in fiscal management, but it must be balanced with considerations of long-term financial or fiscal sustainability.
And now, let's proceed to the primary sources of public borrowing. First, the government bonds. These are debt securities issued by the government to investors. They include treasury bonds, notes, and bills with different maturities and interest rates. Second is treasury bills or T-bills. Short-term securities with maturities of less than 1 year, they are sold at discount and redeemed at face value. Next is the treasury notes or T-notes. Medium-term securities with maturities ranging from 1 to 10 years. They pay interest every 6 months. Next is treasury bonds. T-bonds is a long-term securities with maturities greater than 10 years. They also pay interest every 6 months. Another sources of public borrowing is the municipal bonds, issued by local or state governments to finance public projects. They can be general obligation bonds or revenue bonds. Another is international loans. Governments can borrow from international financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. Next is the bank loans. Governments can secure loans from commercial banks or central banks, though this is less common compared to issuing banks. And lastly, private sector loans. Occasionally, may borrow from private investors or entities. Overall, each source has its own implications for government finances and economic stability. Public borrowing can have various impacts on the economy and economic growth, depending on how it is managed and utilized. And here are some key effects. First, it stimulates economic growth. When borrowed funds are invested in productive infrastructure, education, and health, they can boost economic growth by enhancing productivity and increasing future economic output. Second is crowding out. High levels of public borrowing can lead to crowding out, where government borrowing competes with private sector borrowing for funds, potentially raising interest rates and reducing private investment. The third one is the inflationary pressure. If the economy is near full capacity, increased borrowing can lead to higher aggregate demand, which may cause inflation if supply does not keep pace. Fourth is increased government debt. Resistant borrowing increases national debt, which might lead to higher future taxes or reduced government spending. It can also increase the risk of default or financial instability if not managed prudently. Next is the interest payments. Governments must pay interest on borrowed funds. High debt levels can lead to substantial interest payments, which may divert resources away from productive investments and public services. Next one is the debt sustainability. If borrowing is used to finance investments that generate returns exceeding the cost of debt, it can be sustainable and beneficial. However, excessive or poorly managed borrowing can lead to debt sustainability issues affecting investors' confidence and economic stability. Next is the exchange rate effects. Large-scale borrowing, especially from foreign sources, can impact the exchange rate. If foreign borrowing leads to higher demand for foreign currency, it can devalue the domestic currency, affecting trade balances and inflation. And lastly, the long-term growth. The impact on long-term growth depends on whether the borrowed funds are used effectively. Productive investments can lead to higher growth in the future, while borrowing for current consumption can have less positive long-term effects. Overall, the impact of public borrowing on the economy is complex and context-dependent, relying on factors like the purpose of the borrowing, the current economic conditions, and the management of debt. And now, to measure and analyze public debt, key indicators include the debt to GDP ratio, debt servicing ratio, and distinctions between gross and net debt. The debt to GDP ratio compares the total amount of debt to the country's economic output. showing how burdensome the debt is relative to economic performance. The debt servicing ratio reveals what portion of government revenue is spent on paying off debt interest and principal. Gross debt includes the total debt without subtracting financial assets, while net debt provides a clearer picture by subtracting these assets. Analyzing debt sustainability assess if the country can handle its debt obligations over long term. Evaluating the impact of interest rates helps understand how borrowing costs affect fiscal health, while examining how debt influences economic growth reveals potential constraints on investment and economic activity. Additionally, reviewing the debt composition, such as currency and creditor types, provides insights into the risks and vulnerabilities associated with the debt. These metrics together offer a comprehensive view of how well a country manages its public debt and its broader economic implications.
The debt burden refers to cost of repaying borrowed money and can significantly impact the financial health of the borrower. If debt isn't managed well or if the borrower takes on too many loans, it can lead to worsening situation, like potentially resulting in debt spiral where debt continues to grow. This concept applies not only to individuals and companies, but also to countries. When a government borrows money, it's called public debt or sovereign debt. This debt can be internal, raised through bonds issues with the country, or external, borrowed from foreign sources like other governments, banks, or international organizations. External debt is particularly challenging because it can put a strain on countries' finances. When a nation has high foreign debt, it can struggle to invest in critical areas like infrastructure, healthcare, or education, as much of its tax revenue goes toward debt repayment. This can hinder the country's long-term economic growth. To assess whether someone can afford more debt, financial institutions use debt burden ratio. This ratio compares total monthly debt payments to personal total income, helping determining if they can manage additional loans. Over time, having too much debt can hurt a country's economic growth, slow down growth of the economy, reduce the value of investment and profit, and many leads to higher taxes in the future to pay off the debt. This can result in slower growth and lower standard of living because there is less money available for important areas like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The economy also becomes more vulnerable to financial crisis. When a lot of money is used to pay off debt, businesses have less to spend on improving operation, like producing more products, goods, marketing, or hiring more employees. This situation can also lead to higher debt levels, lower investment, and a decrease in the value of companies, all of which increase the risk of financial trouble. In the Philippines, the Department of Finance explained that out of 5 trillion budget for 2024, only 12.1% is allocated for paying off debt and loans. This includes interest payments and lending money to others. Interest payment or cost of borrowing have been going down. This means that government has more money to spend on important things like education and infrastructure. In 2024, interest payment will take up only 11.6% of the budget, which is good news because it frees more funds for other priorities. The DOF also clarified that when the government pays back the original amount borrowed, the principal, it doesn't count as a new expense. This is because it's just fulfilling the old obligation, not adding to new debt. The government's plan is to lower the country's debt compared to its economic output and reduce the budget deficit over the next few years by improving tax collection, introducing new tax measures, and they believe they can increase revenue and reduce debt. Spending a lot on debt payment can limit the government's ability to invest in other areas like creating jobs or improving infrastructure. This can increase financial risk if not managed carefully.
So the national debt of the Philippines has been a persistent issue throughout its history, significantly impacting economic policies and governance. So according to Bureau of Treasury, the Philippines national debt reached 15.69 trillion as of July 2024. This marks an increase of 1.1 trillion from previous year, primarily driven by government borrowing to fund infrastructure projects and pandemic recovery efforts. The Philippines has experienced fluctuating levels of national debt, often correlating with economic challenges and political changes. Understanding this trajectory is crucial for grasping current fiscal policies and their implications. So, let us discuss some of the key presidential administrations and their debt records. So, first is Ferdinand Marcos Sr. So, at the end of his administration, the national debt stood at approximately 395 billion. So, Marcos's regime saw significant borrowing which laid the groundwork for future fiscal challenges. The debt to GDP ratio was notably high, with the deficit reaching 5.7% of GDP by 1986. The heavy borrowing during this period contributed to a fiscal crisis that would affect subsequent administrations. So, second is Corazon Aquino or Cory Aquino. Aquino inherited a risky fiscal situation but managed to reduce the deficit to about 2% of GDP by 1987. So, by the end of her term, the national debt had escalated to around 870 billion. Her administration focused on stabilizing the economy post-martial law, implementing reforms aimed at restoring investor confidence. So, third is Joseph Estrada. So, Estrada's presidency marked a notable increase in national debt, reaching approximately 2.385 trillion by 2001. So, his term was characterized by economic instability and corruption allegations, which hampered effective fiscal management. And fourth, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. So, Arroyo's administration saw continued borrowing amid efforts to stimulate economic growth. The national debt grew significantly during her time but was often justified as necessary for development projects. So, fifth on the list is Benigno Aquino III, so known for his daang matuwid governance. So, Aquino implemented measures that slowed debt growth while achieving high GDP growth rates. So, his administration left behind a more manageable debt situation compared to predecessors, focusing on transparency and accountability. Sixth is Rodrigo Duterte. So Duterte's administration adopted an ambitious infrastructure program known as Build, 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 so leading to substantial increasing in borrowing. And by the end of his term, national debt soared to approximately 13.419 trillion, raising alarms about sustainability and long-term economic health. And last is Ferdinand Marcos Jr. So the present President Marcos Jr.'s administration has continued the trend of borrowing with an additional 2.423 trillion added to the national debt. The rapid increase in debt has prompted concerns regarding fiscal sustainability and potential impacts on future generations. So, the history of national debt in the Philippines reveals a complex interplay between governance, economic policy, and external factors. So, each president has faced unique challenges that influence their approach to managing public finances. So, as the current administration grapples with rising debts, it is imperative for policymakers to prioritize sustainable fiscal strategies that ensure economic stability while addressing pressing social needs.
Ever borrowed money to invest in property like house, lot, vehicle, or even extra funds for your business? When starting a business, they often had to stretch their budgets to seize opportunities. But let's face it, that can be a scary word. It's a constant reminder of our financial obligations. But is it really as terrifying as it sounds? Debt is essentially borrowing money with a promise to pay it back, plus a little extra as interest. It sounds simple, but it can be, unless, of course, you borrow more than you can handle. And that's when the things get truly scary. Imagine, your country is planning a massive infrastructure project, new roads, bridges, schools. It's a large scale project that needs a lot of funds. Taxes might cover parts of the cost, but often there's a gap. So, what do? They borrow. Of course, taxpayers won't agree to double or at least increase their taxes, as this would also mean a deduction from their take-home salary. The idea is to invest their borrowed money wisely, build things that create jobs, improve lives, and boost the economy. Maybe even cut taxes or give money directly to the people who need it. It sounds good, but here's the million-dollar question. Do they always use it wisely? This often results in underfunded programs, deteriorating facilities, and decline in service quality. Consequence of that burden can also result in increased taxes. For the government to generate the necessary revenue to repay the debt, governments often resort to increased taxes. This can take various forms, such as the income taxes, sales taxes, or corporate taxes. Higher taxes reduce disposable income for individuals, which is the take salary, and profit or net income in terms of businesses, that hindering consumption and investment. Third, crowding out of private investment. When governments borrow heavily, they increase the demand for funds competing with the private sector. And when the government borrow a lot, it takes money away from businesses. This creates a shortage of money, and when there's less money available for everyone, the cost of borrowing money or the interest rate goes up. And we can relate this to the law of supply and demand. And this will result to higher interest rates, making it harder for businesses to grow. While borrowing can be a powerful tool, it's a double-edged sword, like an individual carrying too much credit card debt. A nation burdened by excessive borrowing face severe consequences. Now, let's explore the potential challenges that both citizens and the nation's economy might face. Consequences of debt burden in fiscal constraints. Government debt causes significant limitations on a nation's financial resources due to heavy financial obligations. This is manifested in several ways. First, it can reduce government spending on essential services. We are all aware that the primary obligations of a government is to provide essential services like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. However, a substantial portion of the budget is diverted towards servicing the debt, leaving limited funds for the crucial areas. As I mentioned earlier, businesses often borrow money to expand and hire new people. If it's too expensive to borrow, they'll be less likely to do this. And because of this, a slow business environment slows down the overall economy. This has a ripple effect on taxes, as businesses that aren't growing and hiring generate less income and therefore pay few taxes. Additionally, when unemployment rises due to economic slowdown, the government collects less income tax. This reduces tax revenue that limit public spending on essential services and infrastructure, further impacting economic growth. Now, let's proceed to the consequence of debt burden in economy. The fiscal constraints imposed by debt have far-reaching consequences for the overall economy. These constraints ripple through the economy. That will only means that the impact will spread and affecting other sectors. In terms of economic instability, a high level of debt can make an economy vulnerable to shocks such as financial crisis or economic downturn. The fear of default can lead to investors' uncertainty, capital flight, and currency depreciation. Second, it can reduce the GDP growth or gross domestic product. The diversion of resources towards debt servicing reduce government spending on productive sectors of the economy. This can stifle economic growth as investment in infrastructure economic, and research and development are crucial for long-term prosperity. Also, this can cause deterioration of living standard. The combination of reduced government spending and higher taxes can significantly impact the quality of life for citizens. Access to quality education, healthcare, and public services diminish, leading to a decline in overall well-being. Last but not least, this can cause to increase risk of insolvency. In extreme cases, a government may become unable to meet its debt obligation, leading to insolvency. This can have catastrophic consequences, including economic collapse and social unrest. Now, in terms of social implication, as beyond the economic impact, debt burden also has profound social consequences. Like, this can cause intergenerational inequality, meaning the burden of debt is often passed on the future generations. They inherit a higher tax burden and limited access to public services, creating an unfair advantage for previous generations. That can also cause business constraints, as a high level of debt can create a challenging business environment. Increased taxes, higher interest rates, and reduced government spending on infrastructure and support programs can hinder businesses' growth and job creation. Another one is this can lead to vulnerability to economic shocks, as a highly indebted economy is more susceptible to the negative impact of economic shocks such as recession or natural disasters. These events can exacerbate financial difficulties and lead to social unrest. By understanding these consequences, policymakers and citizens can appreciate the urgent need for sustainable debt management and the importance of prioritizing long-term economic health. A good example of this is, imagine two countries, country A and country B, both borrowed $100 billion. But looking closely, we can see that country A, with a $1 trillion GDP, has a bigger economic size as measured by GDP. For country A, paying back the debt is like paying off a small loan with a high income. For country B, it's like trying to pay off a huge loan with a tiny salary. This makes a big difference in how easily they can manage their debts. So why does this matter? Well, when we have a solid economy, it's easier to convince lenders to give you more money, meaning more opportunities to improve economic health. But if you're struggling and if an economic crisis hits, a country with healthy financial cushion is better equipped to weather the storm. But take note, while economic size, as measured by GDP, is a crucial factor in determining a country's ability to manage debt, it's not the only one. Other factors could influence its actual debt repayment capacity. One of these is government efficiency. If the government effectively manage its finances and resources, this can significantly impact debt management. So whether you're a booming economy or a developing nation, managing debt wisely is crucial because it's the key to a stable financial future.
So the real question is the public debt as debt is a burden on the future generations? But before we answer that question and dig deeper into that matter, let us first hear some thoughts from a government employee and a citizen of this country, Mrs. Odessa Abarcanesio.
Is public debt a burden to the future generations? Well, it depends. Kung iisipin natin yung lumulobong national debt ng ating gobyerno, ang unang papasok sa isip natin ay dagdag na taxes at reduced income. Ito ay nangyayari dahil syempre yung ating sweldo nababawasan once na sumweldo tayo, kinakaltas na agad doon yung tax. And then kapag bumibili tayo ng mga produkto or groceries, may tax na kaakibat. Pag nag-avail tayo ng mga services, meron ding taxes na ini-impose sa atin. So sa lahat ng ginagastos natin, or pati yung kuryente, tubig, mga commodities, may taxes yan nakaakibat. So kapag ka ganun, nababawasan yung purchasing power ng ating pera. So kung titingnan natin talagang yung public debt is a burden. But if you look at it in the future, and kung saan ginamit ng government yung public debt na yun, for example, sa isang project ng gobyerno na nag-generate ng income, for example, in-invest yan sa isang project na kumikita, then sa future, it means mag-generate din siya ng additional income, and yung project na yun would benefit, or yung income na yun magbe-benefit doon yung mga future generations. So, it depends kung paano ginamit ng government yung public debt na yun, kung saang project niya ginamit. So, it could be a burden kung hindi ginamit ng tama, if it is not spent wisely. Pero kung ito ay ginamit sa isang makabuluhang proyekto, ay hindi siya magiging burden. Magiging beneficial siya para dun sa mga future generations.
So, based on our research, we found this article from the Concord Coalition where it explores the implications of the national debt, particularly how it affects future generations. So, it emphasizes that while current generations may benefit from government spending financed through borrowing, the long-term consequences can be detrimental to those who will inherit these debts. So, this article presents some key arguments. So first is the intergenerational burden. So the article argues that national debt effectively shifts the financial burden onto future taxpayers. So current spending financed by debt means that future generations will face higher taxes or reduced government services to pay off this debt. So in this article, various economic models are referenced or used to illustrate how increased national debt can lead to lower levels of capital investment. This reduction in investment can stifle economic growth, ultimately affecting living standards of the future generation. And second key argument is the opportunity cost. So the concept of opportunity cost is central to the article's argument. When the government borrows money, it may divert resources away from more productive uses, leading to less efficient economic outcomes. So this misallocation can hinder growth and innovation. So the article also suggests that high levels of national debt can crowd out private investment, as government borrowing can lead to higher interest rates. This in turn can limit the resources available for businesses and entrepreneurs, further impacting economic growth. So the third key argument is the role of policymakers. So the article calls for policymakers to adopt more fiscally responsible practices. It stresses the importance of balancing budgets and making informed decisions about spending and borrowing to avoid passing on an unsustainable debt burden to future generations. So, the article emphasized the need for long-term economic planning. So, the article advocates for policies that prioritize sustainable fiscal practices over short-term gains. So, in conclusion, the article presents that while national debt can provide immediate benefits to current generation, it poses significant risk and burdens for future generations. So the authors urge for a re-evaluation of borrowing practices and the commitment to fiscal responsibility to ensure a stable economic future. So by addressing these issues proactively, policymakers can help mitigate the adverse effect of national debt and secure a better economic landscape for those who come after us. So this comprehensive analysis serves as a call to action for both policymakers and the public to recognize the long-term implications of national debt and to work towards sustainable economic solutions. So, based on the article, public debt can be a burden on future generations in several ways. So, first is increased taxation. So high levels of public debt may require higher taxes in the future to service the debt and prevent default. So this can limit the economic opportunities and disposable income of younger generations. So second is reduce government spending. So debt servicing costs can crowd out government spending on education, healthcare, and infrastructure, which are crucial for the long-term well-being and productivity of future generations. So third is economic instability. So excessive public debt can lead to economic crises such as currency devaluation and high inflation, which can have severe consequences for future generations. So fourth is intergenerational inequity. So the burden of repaying public debt may fall disproportionately on future generations, while the benefits of the spending financed by the debt may have been enjoyed by earlier generations. So here are some factors to mitigate the burden. So first is productive investment. So if public debt is used to finance productive investments such as in education, infrastructure, and research and development, it can boost economic growth and improve the living standards of future generations. Second is economic growth. High economic growth can reduce the relative burden of public debt over time, as the economy expands and generates more revenue to service the debt. So third is debt restructuring. So governments can negotiate with creditors to restructure the debt, such as by extending repayment periods or reducing interest rates, to ease the burden on future generations. So next is intergenerational transfers. So government can implement policies that transfer resources from older to younger generations, such as through pension reforms or targeted investments in education and training to offset the potential negative effects of public debt. So to conclude, the impact of public debt on future generations is complex and depends on various factors, including the purpose of the debt, economic conditions, and government policies. While excessive public debt can be a burden, it is not always clear-cut case, and governments can take measures to mitigate its potential negative effects on the future generations. And that's all for today. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.